Good afternoon. Let us bow our heads and open our hearts in the presence of our Creator, our God, and ask for guidance for His chosen people here today, chosen by their people and sent to speak for and debate on the best for everyone. Creator God, grant us the strength of character to act in the honest interests of our northern peoples. Grant us the ability to hear each other's concerns, to assess honestly and decide wisely the outcome of our labors for the present and future of our North and all of us. May we be respectful to each other's opinion and views and respect the dignity of office entrusted to us and the method of our unique form of government. Bless our hearts and minds to right and our labors to you and your people. Creator God, grant us this humble wish and request. Amen. Please be seated.
Members, it's a beautiful day. First of all, I would like to thank Anthony Whitford for doing our opening prayer. He will also be joining us at the clerk's table. I thank him for that. Members, on behalf of the Assembly, I would like to thank everyone for joining us here and people that's joining us in the gallery. I am pleased to welcome everyone back to the House to resume the third session of the 18th Assembly. I would like to welcome our visitors in the gallery. I would like to take a few minutes to acknowledge a very special event in our legislature since we last met. Last week, we hosted our 16th annual Youth Parliament. 19 high school students representing each electoral district in the N.W.T participated and received a first-hand look at the workings of our unique system of government. I applaud all 19 members of this year's Youth Parliament for a job well done. The level of debate, the commitment shown by these young people, and the respect the youth parliamentaries demonstrated for each other and the Assembly was very impressive and admirable. I am sure you agree with me that the future of the Northwest Territories appears to be in very good hands. I know that many of you have traveled across our vast territories to hear the thoughts of Northerners on legislation. I know how hard members, along with our Legislative Assembly staff, have worked these past few weeks. I hope you also enjoyed the experience of visiting many of our communities, that this experience will serve you well as you embark on the work ahead of you. Although this is a short setting, there is a great deal of work that must be done before we adjourn next week, and I know that you are eager to begin. Now, colleagues, to the business before us. I look forward to a very productive session and remind you all of the standards that you have set to guide your deliberation within this House and to demonstrate your respect and commitment to our unique form of consensus-style government. I would also like to take on this opportunity to pass on the condolences of this House to the families and communities who have lost loved ones since we last met. Please accept our sincere sympathy. This week, we will be assisted by pages from across the Northwest Territories. They will become eyewitnesses on how we do our work on behalf of the people of the Northwest Territories. I hope that they enjoy their experience, and I am confident they will do a great job for us. It is now my duty to advise this House that I have received the following message from the Commissioner of the Northwest Territories. It reads, "Dear Mr. Speaker, I wish to advise you that I recommend to the Legislative Assembly of the Northwest Territories the passage of Supplementary Appropriation Act Infrastructure Expenditures 2018 and 19 and Supplementary Appropriation Act Operation Expenditure number 2, 2018-2019 during the third session of the 18th Assembly. Yours truly, Margaret M. Tom, Commissioner. Mussy, colleagues." First, Minister's statement.
I would like to welcome members back for the continuation of the third session of the 18th Legislative Assembly. We have a brief sitting this spring, but some important matters to consider as we continue to work together to build a better future for our territory and its residents. The Government of the Northwest Territories continues to work hard to create a future full of opportunity and promise for territorial residents. Strategic engagement with the Government of Canada to help advance northern priorities and interests is one of the ways our government can achieve that. The Government of Canada continues to have important responsibilities to support economic, social, and political development in the Northwest Territories. We know they take this responsibility seriously, and we have been working hard with them to turn their commitment into practical action and investments in our territory. Continuing to meet with our federal counterparts to promote Northwest Territories' priorities and interests is an important part of our successful strategy for engaging Canada. Most recently, I met with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, along with Nunavut Premier Paul Quassa and Yukon Premier Sandy Silver, as part of the Northern Premiers Forum in Ottawa at the beginning of this month. I was pleased that Prime Minister Trudeau personally reaffirmed his government's commitment to the Northwest Territories and to working with our government on shared priorities. It was particularly important to hear from the Prime Minister that Canada agrees that the Pan-Territorial Vision for Sustainable Development issued by our three territories last August will form the basis for the Arctic Policy Framework. Placing sustainable economic development at the heart of federal policy in the North will be critical to creating a better, more prosperous future for residents. It will be critical for Canada to match its policy commitments to our territory with specific investments and funding commitments, and premiers were encouraged to learn that Canada will be using the Arctic Policy Framework to guide future funding commitments in its upcoming federal budgets. Our government's efforts to directly engage the federal government on behalf of the Northwest Territories are starting to pay off. In recent months, we have been successful in securing a number of significant funding agreements and investments from Canada. In March, Ministers Schuman and Cochrane joined Infrastructure Canada Minister Sohi to announce the signing of a 10-year infrastructure agreement that will see $570 million invested in the Northwest Territories. In April, Canada announced that it's making just over $94 million available to the Northwest Territories and Nunavut over 5 years to make Arctic resupply operations faster, safer, and more efficient for remote communities under its Oceans Protections Plan. The Government of Northwest Territories is looking forward to applying for funding under this program to improve the Mackenzie River and High Arctic Marine Transportation Corridor. This corridor is a critical piece of our northern transportation system, serving some of Canada's northernmost residents, and the new funding will help support economic development in a region increasingly being recognized as an area of opportunity. Our government is pleased with this recent commitment from Federal Minister of Transport Marc Garneau, and also hopes for positive news regarding our applications for funding under the National Trade Corridor Fund for projects that will help advance the Mackenzie Valley Highway. We also look forward to a second call for applications under this fund as an opportunity to advance the Slave Geological Province Access Corridor. Also in April, Ministers Moses and Federal Minister of Families, Children and Social Development, Jean-Yves Duclos, announced a 3-year agreement to invest over $7 million in early learning and childcare in the Northwest Territories. This funding will support delivery of high-quality early learning and childcare, culturally relevant professional development and training for all staff working within licensed early childhood programs. An increase in the number of qualified early childhood development professionals in licensed programs and access to early learning and childcare opportunities within all communities in the Northwest Territories. Advancing, finalizing, and implementing land, resources, and self-government agreements is a priority of this Legislative Assembly, Mr. Speaker, and another area where success will create a better future for Northwest Territories residents. Settlement of land claims in the southern part of the territory is also a priority for our government and will be a critical factor in affirming the rights of Indigenous people in these regions, creating certainty and helping unlock the economic potential of the Northwest Territories to create benefits and opportunities for all residents. The Government of Northwest Territories is committed to achieving success at these tables and has worked hard with all parties to identify a path forward on negotiations with the Decho First Nations, Northwest Territories Métis Nation, and the Quechua-Dene First Nation. Last year, the Government of Canada and the Government of the Northwest Territories made innovative new offers to the Northwest Territories Métis and the Quechua, based on the work of a ministerial special representative appointed by Minister Bennett and myself. I'm also pleased to advise members that Canada and the Government of Northwest Territories made a new offer to the Decho First Nation on May 3, 2018 in Fort Simpson. As with the new offers to the Quechua and Northwest Territories Métis, the offer to the Decho was designed to provide them with the flexibility to choose an approach that best reflects their priorities with respect to matters including land quantum, cash, resource management, and land use planning. We expect the new offer will be formally considered by the Decho First Nation at their annual assembly in Wrigley in July. Our negotiators have done some innovative and forward work with their counterparts from the Government of Canada on this offer. We are hopeful this work will help us get beyond past disagreements and old ways of thinking and result in the settlement of this claim. We continue to make progress on the government's legislative agenda, Mr. Speaker. During this sitting, we expect to introduce several pieces of proposed legislation, including the Northwest Territories' first Ombudsman Person Act, a priority for this House and a commitment in the government's mandate. We also expect to introduce an act to amend the Cities, Towns and Villages Act. This bill responds to requests from community governments to have the ability to levy a tourism accommodation tax and to pass bylaws that would permit homeowners to fund energy retrofits and energy-saving technology upgrades through a local improvement charge. During this sitting, we will table the 2017-2018 annual report on the implementation of the mandate of the Government of the Northwest Territories, Mr. Speaker. The annual report indicates that as of March 31st, 2018, our government had fulfilled 60 commitments. Another 160 commitments were in progress by that date, with another 10 in the planning stage. Since March 31st, 19 additional commitments have been fulfilled, bringing the total number of fulfilled commitments to 79. While some of the commitments are fulfilled by a specific activity or action, a number of the commitments relate to work that is ongoing. As we pass the halfway point of this legislative assembly, we are confident in saying that we have taken the steps required to implement many of these commitments and will continue to do so on an ongoing basis. Mr. Speaker, since the mandate was adopted by the 18th Legislative Assembly near the beginning of our term, our government has been focused on fulfilling our commitments and advancing the priorities of this Legislative Assembly. Between June and October of last year, at the midpoint of our term, all members contributed to a comprehensive review of our priorities and the mandate. We had the opportunity to evaluate our progress, consider new information, and reflect on new developments and major events in the Northwest Territories, Canada, and the world. Through this process, we revised the mandate. It now includes 230 commitments to guide our activities through the remainder of this term. Two significant additions to the mandate will be the subject of discussions during this sitting: conducting a foundational review of Aurora College and developing and implementing the policy, program, and legislative regimes necessary to support the legalization of cannabis in the Northwest Territories. Both these initiatives are of great interest to the people of the Northwest Territories and members of the Legislative Assembly. Indeed, there has been much discussion of cannabis legalization in the media in the past few weeks, as standing committees have done their important work to hear from residents on Bill 6. We understand that residents are concerned about the potential impact of legal cannabis on their families and communities, and we respect that concern. Legalization was a federal election promise, and the Government of Canada continues to work towards delivering on that promise in the coming weeks. Many jurisdictions, including our own, are working hard to be ready in time for federal legalization, and while it would be nice to have more time to get ready, it does not look like that will be an option. Our government made a commitment to having effective measures in place to protect the health and safety of Northwest Territories residents when federal legislation comes into effect. We continue to be committed to that goal and are confident that we will be prepared. We do recognize, however, that this is a new area of responsibility for ourselves and the rest of the country, and we will continue to monitor implementation once cannabis has been legalized, so we can identify any areas where we can make improvements and modifications to our plans. The future of Aurora College has also been the subject of much discussion in recent months, and we expect that discussion will continue during this sitting. As members are aware, the government has received the report of the consultants hired to conduct the foundational review of the college. The consultants have delivered a comprehensive report with many recommendations about how we can move forward to create a vibrant post-secondary institution in the North that is positioned to train Northerners for Northern jobs. It is now our job to consider each of those recommendations and use them to determine a path forward for the college. This is the beginning of a longer process to plan for the future of the college, and we look forward to working with MLAs as we develop them together. Northwest Territories residents deserve an educational institution that is focused on preparing them for the challenges and opportunities of tomorrow, and the Aurora College Foundational Review is an opportunity for us to deliver the kind of post-secondary institution they need as a legacy of our work here. This is a brief sitting, Mr. Speaker, but I expect it will be an active one. As always, we have an important responsibility to work together to create positive change for the people and communities of the Northwest Territories. Our government remains committed to that work and looks forward to continuing to work towards that goal during this sitting of the Legislative Assembly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mosley. Minister statements. Minister statements. Member statements. Member for Trinidad-Willowdale.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I would like to speak about the core housing needs across the Northwest Territories. At this time, over 2 years into this government, there is no territorial-wide housing plan that addresses a core need reduction plan on a community-by-community basis. Mr. Speaker, I've risen in this House many times urging our government to create a housing development plan that is pertinent to each of our 33 communities and is comprehensive enough to identify the exact types of core needs that are most pertinent within each community. A thorough plan can better inform the government on how to address the core housing needs in each community. Mr. Speaker, a housing development plan is needed to cost out each community's housing needs. For example, Mr. Speaker, a family of 6 may currently be living in a 2-bedroom unit. However, their needs warrant a 3- or 4-bedroom unit. The housing plan would tell us whether to build a new house or add on to the current unit. Mr. Speaker, one solution would cost in excess of $300,000, while the other could be under $100,000. On the contrary, Mr. Speaker, a family may have enough bedrooms but may need repairs that could range from $10,000 to $100,000. In another case, Mr. Speaker, a core need may be affordability, and perhaps a family could be provided with a monthly subsidy of $300 to $1,000 per month, thereby removing that family from core need for just $3,600 to $12,000 per year. Mr. Speaker, the Housing Development Plan, or whatever the government chooses to call it, is a plan that would work actively to address core needs on housing and on a community-specific basis. According to the N.W.T. Bureau of Statistics community survey in my riding of Trinidad-Willowdale, the core need total households range from a low of 24.9% in Fort Resolution to a high of 37.2% in Deda. Mr. Speaker, the N.W.T. Housing Corporation must begin discussions with communities and Indigenous governments to address these issues. I believe that the N.W.T. Housing Corporation must begin to fund these governments directly in order to achieve the best results regarding the reduction of core need within these communities. Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Member statement. Member Ike-Godin and the member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it gives me great pleasure to announce to this Assembly that the 2018 Arctic Winter Games, hosted by Hay River, Fort Smith, and the N.W.T. First Nation, were an overwhelming success. That's not just my opinion. I've heard it from many other residents of the South Slave, from members of the various national and international delegations that attended the Games, and from the Arctic Winter Games International Committee, who've seen their fair share of the Games. I'm sure the other MLAs who were able to spend the entire week in the South Slave would also agree with me. Minister Cochrane spent time in both Hay River and Fort Smith, and I know for a fact that she was impressed with what she saw. The Premier also spent the week in Hay River, and every time I saw him, sure looked like he was having a good time. Especially when he capped his week off presenting the gold Ulus to both of Team NT's male hockey teams, one of which included his very own grandson. Mr. Speaker, the success of the 2018 Games redefined the very notion of who can host these Games. Essentially, the South Slave was a testing ground, used to determine whether or not smaller communities could host the Games. And guess what? It can be done, and can be done in spectacular fashion. However, there's one caveat. If small communities want to host the Games, they need dedicated volunteers and lots of them. According to Greg Rowe, the president of the South Slave Host Society, volunteers are the heart and soul of the Games. Luckily, the South Slave has a big heart. Between Hay River and Fort Smith, there were 1,500 volunteers. Mr. Speaker, that's over 20% of the combined population of both communities. That's absolutely amazing. Some people were only able to pick up a handful of volunteer shifts, but they did what they could. Some people took leave from their jobs and volunteered full-time. Some people worked all day and then volunteered all evening. It was not uncommon to hear about volunteers putting in 10, 12, or 16 hours a day, every day. And then, Mr. Speaker, there are the people who put in 4 years. I'm speaking, of course, of the Host Society Board of Directors. Without their efforts, the Games would have never made their way to the South Slave in the first place. For their efforts, the Host Society was presented with the N.W.T. Outstanding Volunteer Award for a group just earlier today, and rightly so. So, Mr. Speaker, I ask this Assembly to join me in thanking all of the volunteers for making the 2018 Arctic Winter Games such a great success. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike-Godin and the member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. On May 1st, Cabinet released the Energy Strategy and Climate Change Strategic Framework. What's still missing for a complete package on climate change is a firm proposal and legislative changes for carbon pricing. Today, I'm calling out Cabinet on its efforts on climate change. I strongly urge the federal government to reject the climate change plan as it falls far short of any likelihood of successfully reaching the Pan-Canadian Framework obligation of a 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from 2005 levels by the year 2030. These are strong words, Mr. Speaker, but backed up by the following facts. 44% of the greenhouse gas reductions to meet the Pan-Canadian Framework target are to be met with hydroelectric power from huge expansions of the Tolson facilities. No quantification of the GHG reductions is provided. There's no money to build the dams or power lines that will cost billions, and no confirmed buyers either north of the lake or in the provinces. The energy strategy is masquerading as an infrastructure proposal to the federal government, characterized by local media as an ultimatum, rather than a serious effort to address climate change and build energy self-sufficiency. Most of the greenhouse gas reductions are backloaded into the available time. 60% of the reductions are supposed to take place in the last 5 years. Most of the effort is to be directed at electricity production, which is not the major source of greenhouse gas emissions. The 17% GHG reduction target for industry was removed in the final version. Lastly, the Auditor General's finding on our failed climate change leadership has not been addressed, as the framework and audit response make no proposals to change our approach. I've called for a Climate Change Act or Cabinet-approved policy, Financial Management Board consideration of climate change implications, and infrastructure submissions that prioritize projects that show the greatest greenhouse gas reductions. The residents of the N.W.T. deserve much better on the issue of climate change, reductions to our cost of living through energy self-reliance, while building a greener economy. The federal government should reject Cabinet's approach on climate change and send us back to the drawing board to develop a real plan. Must see, Mr. Speaker.
Must see. Member statement. Member Ike-Godin and then Member Mackenzie Delta.
Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this afternoon I bring to your attention the Lewis Cardinal and Abraham Francis ferries. The Lewis Cardinal operates on the Mackenzie River connecting Sigachik to the Dempster Highway, and the Abraham Francis operates on the Peel River closer to Fort McPherson. Mr. Speaker, my home community of Sigachik is only accessible by winter ice roads 5 months out of the year and by the ferry services another 5 months during the summer season. Fort McPherson is connected to the Dempster Highway and during the summer months is only accessible by the Abraham Francis and Lewis Cardinal ferries. Mr. Speaker, the Peel River ice moved on May 10th. The ice has cleared now for the past week and the water levels are receding. The Mackenzie River ice has started moving on May 15th. The ice has thinned and water levels are also receding. Mr. Speaker, like many of our communities in the Beaufort Delta, Fort McPherson and Sigachik prices increase. The cost of living goes up in the fall when the ferry shuts down and again in the spring when the ice road closes. Ferry services also connect our communities to Central Inuvik, where we have access to the hospital, dental, and other business opportunities. We depend on the ferry, and to date, we have heard nothing about when they will be launched, and operating services may take up to 2 weeks. Let's not forget the expectations of tourists to our region and bringing in money, enhancing our economy. The Northwest Territories has so much to offer in terms of scenery and excellent tour guides waiting to show off our country. Mr. Speaker, people in Sigachik and Fort McPherson have been asking me questions of when the Lewis Cardinal and Abraham Francis ferries will start operating, and I'll have questions for the Minister later today. Thank you.
Must see. Member statement. Member Ike-Godin and then Member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when MLAs sat together and developed the mandate, we needed a tool that we could use to serve the people of the N.W.T., not a document that would get dusty sitting on a shelf somewhere. My job as a regular member, as all of us regular members and members of the House, is to uphold, promote, and protect that mandate. Among our mandate commitments, we included cost of living as our second priority item. Specifically, we committed that the 18th Legislative Assembly will lower the cost of living. Since then, here's a sample of what residents have felt impacting their costs of living in the 2.5 years of this Assembly. 7 consecutive years of power rate increases equating to a near 40% increase during that time. New airport taxes which increase the cost of everything through air transport. Increased land lease fees by up to 300%, increased medical service fees, increased HO bridge tolls. Coming soon, apparently, a land transfer tax. Also coming soon, an N.W.T. carbon tax, and that's on top of Alberta's carbon tax that we already pay on goods and services from the south. Mr. Speaker, none of these initiatives was identified in the mandate. So I was not elected by the people of Yellowknife North to support and promote those initiatives. I was elected to support the commitment we made to lower the cost of living, but so far that commitment seems a distant reality. I agree that we have to get our fiscal house in order, but that is achieved by smart and disciplined management on a day-to-day basis, Mr. Speaker, not by spending wildly and going on hiring sprees and maxing out the line of credit on one term and then hacking, slashing, and laying workers off in the next term. Mr. Speaker, our residents are feeling stymied in trying to move ahead in life and are finding it harder and harder to afford living here. They are continuously being penny pinched. The words savings and investing are lost. People on fixed incomes are even at higher risk from the impacts of the cost of living. And who suffers? We all do. When a family's disposable income begins to deplete, that's the beginning of a slowing economy, one that results in some saying that our territorial economic outlook appears grim. Mr. Speaker, the tone has to change, the trends need to start going in the right direction, and the stats must start reflecting positive outcomes. Northerners want to trust that we have their backs and that we are building a future that they can count on. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike-Godin and then Member Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and welcome back, colleagues. I hope everybody had a pleasant spring. Mr. Speaker, in recognition of the upcoming N.W.T. Tourism Week, I share the following. As mentioned during the last session, on the invitation to attend a trade mission in China on behalf of the Titio Limited Company, the business arm of the N.W.T. government. Mr. Speaker, more specifically, Destination Delaney has launched a specific and determined plan to attract Asian tourists to the community on the shores of Great Bear Lake. It is pertinent to note that the government of the Northwest Territories, Department of ITI, provided resources to help facilitate this trip, including 8 days in China. Cities included in this itinerary focused on Beijing, Shanghai, Hangzhou, and Shanxi. Mr. Speaker, Destination Delaney's equity position to this community venture includes $2 million in upgrading additional hotel cabins. Forthcoming would be client hospitality training. Mr. Speaker, of significant importance and evidence to the trip's success is the community representatives tour company Beijing Best Tour Company Limited signing a cooperation agreement in the efforts of tailored packages. Mr. Speaker, the Beijing Best Tour Company is organizing a trip to Delaney later this summer. This contingency will include some 25 travel agents. This is a tremendous opportunity for both groups, and particularly Delaney, to contribute additional N.W.T. destinations while sharing the unique community, northern culture, and pristine environment. Mr. Speaker, overall, the trip was deemed an overwhelming success, and new awareness has been garnered, and I wish to thank Titio and the N.W.T. government leadership. Later, Mr. Speaker, I will have questions to the Minister of ITI. Massey.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike-Godin and then Member Nanakput.
Good evening, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I'd like to recognize 3 high school graduates from Helen Kalvak School in YELLOWKNIFE. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Jacob Klinkenberg is graduating this year with full academic grade 12 and is accepted into a 2-year social work diploma at Nova Scotia Community College. Mr. Speaker, Jacob is a role model to his peers while earning an academic education. He still ensured that he maintained his cultural hunting, fishing, and traveling practices. During his years at Helen Kalvak School, he participated in many sports and activities, including judo, boxing, biathlon, and student council. He has been the lead youth volunteer for many years and has been willing to freely give himself to help on school fundraisers, activities for younger students, and to help elders around the community. Mr. Speaker, Matt Chloe Kunayuk is graduating this year with full academic grade 12 and is accepted into a 4-year Bachelor of Arts program, planning on majoring in psychology at Vancouver Island University. He's also the valedictorian for this year's graduation class. Mr. Speaker, Matt has been a strong advocate for youth at Helen Kalvak School during his high school career. During his time, he took on role of the president and the student council and immediately took over the planning and implementation of school dances, movie nights, and after-school art club and creation of the GSA. Matt is a genuine person who nothing more than to help has been one of our most dedicated volunteers over the past 3 years. Mr. Speaker, finally, Ms. Nadine Kuniluk is graduating this year with a full academic grade 12 diploma, but has not yet decided on her career path to follow. Mr. Speaker, Nadine is a joy to be around and enjoys nothing more than helping, spreading her optimism and working with younger students. During her high school years, she was very active in the student council and assisting and planning and supervising on every program that was offered. Nadine volunteered in almost all school activities and is dedicated to her fellow students. Mr. Speaker, all 3 students are shining examples of true volunteerism. They gave up much of their time to ensure that their fellow students had activities and a safe space to spend their time. Without these students, schools, Arctic Espresso Cafe would not have ran. The student council would have not grown to where it is, and the GSA would not have been formed. I cannot say enough about these students, as they have been an amazing example of selflessness, wonderful role models, and respected by their peers and members alike. For unanimous, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Member statement. Member Ike Godan and the member Nehende.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on February 20th, 10 students from TSS, accompanied by 2 chaperones, traveled to Vancouver to attend the Wisdom to Action Youth-held Suicide Prevention Program conference that was held at the Aboriginal Centre on East Hastings Street. Conference organizers and contributors included the Mental Health Commission of Canada, Dalhousie University, the Embrace Life Council of Nunavut, and the Canadian Red Cross. The conference was held over 2 days, February 21st and 22nd, and many topics relevant to youth and community were presented and discussed. The organizers recognized that suicide is a leading cause of death among young people in Canada, accounting 24% of all deaths. Unfortunately, young people living in communities with higher rates of suicide, such as ours, are more vulnerable. Youth play an important role in suicide prevention in Canada. They know the pathway to wellness and life enhancement. They can lead programs in their communities that support other young people. They can provide important peer support, formal and informal, and they are advocates for themselves and their communities. Key presenters were elders who spoke, sang, and drummed, and others who presented youth leadership organizations such as Jack.org and the Canadian Red Cross. Youth were fully engaged, and here are 2 quotes I'd like to share. I learned new things and became aware that suicide comes from a lot of different reasons and difficulties. They can be family matters, school relationships, work, mental health, etc. And to avoid and hopefully stop suicide, we talked in the conference about starting working with families. We also talked about activities to keep the youth occupied and themselves feel their importance. All in all, the solution made our environment a happy and healthy community. And going back to our respective towns, I'm hoping and looking forward to becoming a better leader and bringing back the wisdom and knowledge that I've gained from this whole conference. The second quote, the experience of the field trip to actually get out to the community and learn from other cultures was awesome. Now we not just how to prevent suicide, but also have other people bring other teachings. Elders spoke of the circle, saying our circle brings us balance by understanding balance between the spiritual and physical world, and talked about meditation and prayer, finding and doing what we like to do to keep our mental state balanced and finding ourselves for mental and emotional steadiness. Mr. Speaker, moving forward, and the students with the help of the LKFN Wellness Team, we hope to create a youth leadership group that will provide support for our peers and mentor young people. Attending this conference and helped us inform students that the mental health can be discussed openly, and there are many other organizations and professions and caring adults who are equipped to help build our sustain and enhance our mental health. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Member statement. Member Ike Godan and the member YELLOWKNIFE Centre.
Masi, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, while we were away from the House, the Premier shuffled cabinet portfolios. When the music stopped, the Honourable Alfred Moses was sitting on the chairs which gave him responsibility for housing and homelessness. These are the portfolios of primary interest to my constituents in Yellowknife Centre. The Premier's mandate letter to the Minister repeats his letter to the previous Minister. It's as if the last 2 years didn't happen. There is no indication of priorities, just a long list of objectives, and no direction to continue with the changes started by the previous Minister. Since this letter is inadequate, I'm now going to provide a summary of the mandate letter I would have written. First, residents of Yellowknife Centre continue to experience a high level of homelessness. Families are often the invisible homeless, but they are especially hard hit. I have constituents, a working family of 6, who for the last 3 years have been living in a bachelor apartment and who are waiting for suitable housing. The waiting list for transitional housing for families at the YWCA and public housing is both in the hundreds. Federal funding administered by the City for the YWCA Housing First program for families has recently ended. Mr. Speaker, families are facing a housing crisis, and addressing this crisis must be the minister's top priority. Where is the mandate requirement to wrestle every possible new dollar from Ottawa's National Housing Strategy? Second, my riding has a large population of elders. Those who are looking for affordable places to live in their retirement have few choices, and some are deferring retirement while they wait for something to open up. The waiting list for the independent units at Avens is 6 years long. The situation at Northern United Place is also gridlock. Mr. Speaker, I am aware the Housing Corporation is going to build more units for seniors, but I can tell you now it won't be enough to meet these increasing demands. Third, my riding has a large number of rental units. The cost of rent is unaffordable, meaning it consumes more than 30% of the family's budget. The last community survey revealed a total of 800 families in Yellowknife are in core need because their housing is unaffordable. Mr. Speaker, high rents drive people out of Yellowknife and out of the territory at a time when we want more people to live here. The minister must find effective ways to help working families afford a decent place to live. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike-Godin and the member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We begin our legislative sitting on the heels of the Northwest Territory 16th Youth Parliament. It was a real honor to serve as a page for our young leaders, and I'm more impressed than ever seeing the next generation of Northerners hard at work in this great chamber. I was particularly impressed with my counterpart, the youth representative for Cam Lake, Afreen Khan. Ms. Khan is a young bilingual Muslim woman and is the embodiment of what a diverse and progressive N.W.T will look like in the future. Youth parliaments are great forums that give the leaders of today an opportunity to hear the issues that matter most to the leaders of tomorrow. Mr. Speaker, Youth Parliament comes once every 2 years. Imagine how much more we could learn from young Northerners if this government creates its own Youth Advisory Council. It's not a new idea, far from it, as youth councils have been established throughout Canada and the world. For example, the Prime Minister's Youth Council was formed in 2016 and is served by a group of young Canadians who provide nonpartisan advice to the Prime Minister and the Government of Canada on issues important to them and to all Canadians. Youth Council members meet both online and in person several times a year to discuss issues that matter to their peers, to their communities, and to their country. They work together outside of meetings to discuss ideas, engage with local and national organizations, meet with decision-makers like cabinet ministers, and attend public events. Mr. Speaker, this is exactly the kind of engagement that helps lawmakers and governments make good decisions for our people, and the Prime Minister isn't alone in his efforts to open up dialogue with young people on a regular basis. In Ontario, the Premier's Council on Youth Opportunities is a 25-member group of young professionals and leaders aged 16 to 25 who give advice to the Premier and the Minister of Children and Youth. During the last budget talks in Ontario, the Council weighed in on project proposals, and out of the 126 projects reviewed, 33 were recommended by the Youth Council to Ontario's Minister of Finance. This is a clear example of the positive outcomes of engaging with young people through a Youth Council. Mr. Speaker, the governments of Canada, Ontario, and Newfoundland have all implemented Youth Advisory Councils. Northerners know that this government should prioritize engaging all citizens in all of our communities, including and especially young Northerners. We can do so much more to ensure their voices and ideas are brought into our decision-making and into how this government works. Mr. Speaker, politicians are fond of saying the children are our future, but I say it's time we made young people part of today and give Northerners, young Northerners, the voice they deserve through their own Youth Advisory Council. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike-Godin and the member Deschaux.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I recently attended a special high school graduation on the Hay River Reserve. Verna Buggins, Clifford Fabian, Chantal Lafleur, and Ashley Dawn LeBlanc graduated with high school equivalencies on May 18, 2018. with their families and local leaders in attendance. I want to once again congratulate them on their achievement. Mr. Speaker, iti denekoni hato de chiguts grade 12 naginte go how de putli diga halaginda sin hade don't dida iti klekya iti wo guite de klekya tsininde asia diga nitsinida gore iti klekya tsininde dule iti kitzitla gore asia tsininde dule. Mr. Speaker, high school graduating rates are very low on the Hay River Reserve. Most students leave the reserve to attend high school in the town of Hay River, making this high school graduation of 4 graduates a special one. Mr. Speaker, the students took online learning through the Northern Lakes College Alberta upgrading and transferred their credits to the N.W.T. The students study at the Elder Daniel Frere Learning Center with their teacher Liz Pope and work towards fulfilling their credit requirements to graduate from high school. 2 of them met their high school credits, Clifford Fabian and Ashley Dawn LeBlanc. Congratulations. Mr. Speaker, I want to also congratulate their teacher Liz Pope of the Elder Danielson Frere Community Learning Center and to the people of the Aurora College, Fort Smith, that make community learning centers functional and successful. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statements. Member statements. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Members, I'd like to turn your attention to visitors in the gallery. We have with us Mayor of Yellowknife, His Worship, Mark Hike. Thank you for being here with us. And colleagues, allow me your attention to presence in gallery as well for Mr. Anthony W.J. Whitford. As many of you know, Mr. Whitford has many roles. Former commissioner, former speaker, former minister, former member, former sergeant at arms, honorary clerk at the table, and member of N.W.T, Order of N.W.T. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Whitford to the House this afternoon. It's always a pleasure having you here in the House. Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Grey Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I'd like to recognize a couple of people that are incredibly important to me. First, I'd like to recognize my parents, J.R. and Loretta Abernathy, who are proud new grandparents. I'd also like to recognize my amazing wife, Carolyn Smith. And for the first time ever, I'm incredibly proud to introduce my baby boy, John Russell Smith Abernathy, who has been with us for 30 days, 14 hours, 3 minutes and 54, 55, 56, 57, 58 seconds. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I too would like to recognize and add to the list of accolades, welcome Mr. Tony Whitford as Yellowknife North resident. I'd also like to recognize another Yellowknife North resident, Senior Administrative Officer for the City of Yellowknife, Sheila Bassey-Kellett. And of course, recognize, as I always do, my former City Council colleague and the Mayor of the City of Yellowknife, Mayor Mark Hike. Thank you and welcome.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Yellowknife Center.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Mayor Mark Hike is my constituent, and he has served the city with a long and distinguished career as a city councillor and as a mayor, and this may be one of his last appearances here in that role, and so I would like to thank him for the length and the integrity of his public service. Merci.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Thabacha.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to recognize Kevin Smith, Deputy Mayor of Fort Smith, and recently very active in the Arctic Winter Games. Thank you.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Range Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to recognize one of our pages today is from Range Lake, Miss Michaela Lane. Welcome. Thank you.
Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I would like to recognize Mayor Mark Hike. I had the pleasure and honor to serve with him on City Council in my last term, and I believe his first, so there was some overlap, and I want to thank him for his years of service to people in this community. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I don't want to be one of the only Yellowknife members who doesn't recognize His Worship Mayor Mark Hike, and I'd like to thank him for his service as well. He's made an incredible contribution to our community. Thank you.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Acknowledgements. Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sorry about that. I'd like to inform the House that John and Sharon Heron received the Senate's Sequential Centennial Medal of on Sunday, April 8th, from the former Senator Nick Sibiston. It is a very proud moment when residents of the N.W.T are recognized for outstanding work. The medal is awarded to residents actively involved in their community who, throughout generosity, dedication, volunteerism, and hard work, make their community a better place to live. And without a doubt, these two could encompass all of these qualities. Their accomplishments are appreciated and are important to the continuing growth of Fort Simpson. It is an honor and a privilege to recognize them here today.
Merci. Acknowledgements. Acknowledgements. Oral questions. Member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Infrastructure, and it's on the N.W.T Highway. Mr. Speaker, recently the department closed the road due to soft and rutted areas that could be a risk to the traveling public and to prevent further damage to the highway. Mr. Speaker, my first question to the Minister is, why did the Department of Infrastructure open an unfinished road? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, the N.W.T Highway was deemed substantially completed on the 15th of November of last year, and over the winter we experienced an average daily traffic count of 60 to 70 vehicles per day throughout the whole season without any issues. The work that's being performed and carried out on the highway this summer and fall is the contract work that has to be completed under the terms and conditions of the contract and correct all deficiencies noted during the final inspection of the highway. That was when we did that last year. So this work is expected to be completed by the fall of this year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Akira Cassie, member N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I understand, construction of a gravel road on permafrost sometimes requires some time to settlement before it dries up, and I appreciate the response from the Minister. Mr. Speaker, my question, how many days of additional road access did the Hamlet of Tuktoyaktuk gain with the opening of the Inuvik-Tuktoyaktuk Highway? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Speaker, based on the 20-year average of opening and closing of the Inuvik Winter Road, we gained 45 days of access to the community of Tuktoyaktuk this year with the winter road open, or with the road opening in November of last year to May 12th of this year. And as all members know, this has been a concern in the media of lately, but one thing that people have to know, this road is still under construction and we are working on it. And the other thing that I always like to make very prevalent about this whole thing, that this highway was constructed in one of the harshest environments in Canada, and our contractors did a heck of a job of building this road, and we believe it will be open to the general public here very soon. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tada Cassie, member N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the response. Mr. Speaker, I'm just going to get right to here. My next question for the Minister is, what are we doing to make sure this does not happen next year? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said, the contractors have some deficiencies and some works to finish up on the terms of their contract going forward. We have some gravel to lay down, some packing to be done, to be completed. There's a number of things to be done around bridges, rip-wrap and painting and such. So these things are going to be completed this year, as I said, in the fall of this year. But there's some lessons learned to already be taken from the season that we just had it open with different amounts of snow where it is accumulated along the embankments. We've already recognized the fact that we need to put up some snow fencing in certain areas of the highway to help mitigate that. And I think one of the other concerns that we want to address in the next coming season is certain sections of the highways where the accumulation is so big, grading is not going to be sufficient, and we got to look at snow blowing this stuff farther away from there, similar to what we do on the Dempster. So we will be looking at different additives as well, I think, to help with the gravel and how to shed water off the highway. And we will continue to look at improvements to make sure we keep this thing open as long as possible. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question. Member N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's good for the general public to know, and appreciate the work the department's doing. I know how challenging it is as being an employee of that maybe 4 years ago. Mr. Speaker, my final question to the minister is what work remains, and will there be further closures? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've said, there's a full layer of gravel that needs to be laid down on some sections, and compacting that needs to be done this year. Some of this work wasn't done in the fall of last year due to the early cold temperatures, and that type of work can't be performed. There will be additional signage that needs to be installed around there, shaping of embankments in different places along the highway system, and deficiencies in final inspection. And like I said, some work around the bridges and culverts that need to be finished up. People have to realize that this is a new highway. We are working very hard to get this thing open. As the other member from the Bodell has mentioned, this is going to be important to tourism going forward, and the department is working very hard along with our contractors to make sure we get this thing in shape and it's safe for the open public to use, and we will continue to work on that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, the member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I spoke in my earlier statement about the need for a youth advisory council to give young people in the Northwest Territories a voice into government decision-making and to advise government on policy issues. I brought this issue before the House before, but today I'd like to ask the Premier, as most of these youth councils are creatures of First Ministers, if the Premier has made any progress with his government on developing a youth advisory council for the Northwest Territories. Thank you.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to redirect the question to the Minister responsible for youth. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister responsible for youth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I agree that the Youth Parliament is an exciting opportunity for young people to become engaged and involved in politics. I think we had a really good opportunity to see that during the most recent Youth Parliament. And beyond the Youth Parliament, I don't believe that there has been any action taken to establish a year-round Youth Council in this government or previous governments. But as the Minister responsible for youth, I will be happy to receive any recommendations from the member or committee or any members of the Legislative Assembly on how we can address getting something like this started up. I do know that in the past, through youth portfolios, we have provided support for such things as youth conferences, youth events. Through MACA, we have the Youth Corps program as well as Youth Ambassador training programs. But currently, there's really nothing that in terms of work that has been done around a youth council, but I'm more than willing to take recommendations and suggestions from members of this Legislative Assembly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'll ask this minister if he recalls when he made a commitment on the floor of the House to look into this issue and work on a proposal or some sort of policy development for establishing a youth council. That is a commitment he made on the floor. Does he recall that, and is he working on that? Thank you.
Minister responsible for youth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yes, I do recall making that that commitment. Work to date, there hasn't been much work done on it. I will have to bring it to the Committee of Cabinet to look forward, but any other suggestions that the member or standing committee can provide us in terms of what we should be doing, we really appreciate that. We're obviously all working together to address some of these issues, so I welcome any suggestions from the members moving forward. But I will bring that to Committee of Cabinet to look at how we can move forward on that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the minister responsible for youth advise on why there's been why there have been delays in moving this along? You made a commitment in the last sitting of the House, which was several months ago. What are the factors that have contributed to the delay of developing a policy proposal for establishing a youth council in the Northwest Territories? Thank you.
Minister responsible for youth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as the members know, we do have a very big mandate to address and work on, and we've made that commitment as government to get those mandate commitments done. I know that the Government of Canada has worked on youth council. That's something new that they've addressed this year. So we're working on our mandate commitments as well as the general business of government. So it's when we're giving new direction on something like a youth council or policy, I mean, our priorities are making sure that we focus on our mandate commitments that we made at the beginning of this 18th Assembly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the minister asked for suggestions. So, I mean, I'm not sure much more to suggest other than a youth advisory council. Youth Parliament is a model parliament. It's not an advisory body. Youth Corps, all these volunteer activities, they're about engagement and getting people involved. Can the minister commit to directing his staff in the youth, to working with the Minister of Municipal and Community Affairs, which he is, to direct his staff, now that he's got them, in his department to prioritize this work? Because there are my understanding is there are 3 full-time people in his department who work on youth issues. Can they start putting something together? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister responsible for youth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, first and foremost, I want to just thank my staff within MACA for the work that they do. They do have a very extensive work to do with all of our communities throughout the Northwest Territories, as well as youth and volunteers that we do work with. I don't want to say that we're not fully resourced, but I want to make sure that the work that we set out in our mandate and the work that we do with our community governments, our hamlets, that work gets done, because those are essential services that we provide to residents of the Northwest Territories. To take them away from that kind of work around essential services and some of our youth programs and development programs to start focusing on a youth council, I think we need to look at our priorities when it does come to essential services throughout the Northwest Territories. I will be working and chatting with them and continuing to support the youth programs that we currently have in place. But as I mentioned, I want to make sure that my staff focus on the work that's needed for residents of the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, the member N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in my member statement, I spoke of the core needs for housing in the Northwest Territories. I'd like to ask the Minister of the Housing Corporation if there will be a plan to reduce core need presented to the Assembly in the near future. Thank you.
Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yes, Mr. Speaker, in 2017, the N.W.T. Housing Corporation did seek feedback from the residents and our stakeholders through our housing engagement survey. We did hear from our residents on what is needed in all of our communities. Further specific actions to address core needs were detailed in the Towards Level Ground publication, which also includes costing by initiative. This government is committed to decreasing core need by 250 households per year, and each initiative developed under the strategic renewal of the N.W.T. Housing Corporation is intended to address the core need. Some of these initiatives do include seniors aging in place retrofits, our rental supplement program that we have with non-government organizations, community housing support initiative, housing support worker pilot, developing community plans with all of our 33 communities across the Northwest Territories, as well as new home ownership programs that we are working on. We are working with our Indigenous governments, with partners, to address the core housing need in our communities, and I think that's something that's really taken off during this government, and working with our Indigenous governments and community governments to address this. And I've been willing to give more of an update to standing committee and members and some of the more detailed programs as we move forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Cassie, member Trinity Willoughby.
I'd like to thank the Minister for that response. We're not seeing the actual work on the ground, unfortunately. That's lots of good planning, but no action. Mr. Speaker, when is the N.W.T. Housing Corporation planning to update the comprehensive needs survey? From 2017 to 2018, in Northwest Territories, there was 1,200 jobs lost. So I'm assuming that there has some impact on the affordability of housing in the Northwest Territories. So I think it's urgent that we do something, instead of staying with the 2014 needs survey, that we do something that is current today. So I'd like to ask the Minister when that's going to happen. Thank you.
Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I do look forward to working with committee as well as our stakeholders on addressing the core housing needs throughout the Northwest Territory. The next N.W.T. community survey will commence in January of 2019. And as I mentioned, if the member does have any specific communities or saying that work's not being done in some of the communities, if you can let me know a little bit more specifics, we can look at addressing it. Like I said, I'll give a more detailed presentation to committee or to members if they would like upon the request. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Tadade Cassie, member Trinity Willoughby.
Thank you, Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I can provide that information that the Minister is asking for. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Minister what the target is for core need. Across the country, the core needs levels are about 12%. We in the Northwest Territories always sit at about 20%. So after years and years of putting $100 million a year into housing, we're still at 12%. I mean, it's still at 20% across the territory, and we haven't moved from there. I don't know. Maybe we've gone up, maybe we've gone down. I don't know what has happened since 2014. There's no new survey to indicate that. So I'd like to ask the Minister, assuming that we're working off the 2014 numbers of 19.8% core need across the territory, what is the target for when you reduce core need by 250 units per year? What's the new target number after that work is done? Thank you.
Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I mentioned earlier, we are committed, this government is committed to decreasing core need by 250 households per year. We have various initiatives that we are doing to address the core needs, whether it's home ownership repairs, new unit constructions, looking at seniors housing. We're doing a senior housing study as well. But it really takes a really strong partnership with some of our stakeholders as well as some of our community governments, Indigenous governments to address this, and also work that we've been doing with the federal government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nundere Cassie, member Trinity Willoughby.
Mr. Speaker, I'm glad to hear the ministers speak about work with the community governments. I'd like to ask the minister if there is a plan to directly fund the Aboriginal governments or community governments in order to address core need housing in the communities. Thank you.
Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned, one of the ways we're doing this is through the Community housing support initiatives. We do have some really good partnerships with some of our Indigenous governments currently, and we're going to continue to work with them. But we're open to working with community governments as well as Indigenous governments to see how we can work together to address some of the housing needs that we see in our communities. But we are committed, we're willing to meet with our Indigenous governments moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, the member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on March 22nd, I got a Christmas present, a little earlier, maybe a little bit late, from the Department of Lands. This is a press secretary release saying that there was going to be a media announcement about the leases in there. So this has been a gift that's been given to me ever since then, and I keep on getting questions from my leadership and members in the communities. So this is my question to the Minister of Lands. Can the Minister please advise why the media offer is offered to them after our winter session and not during winter session? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The new leases amounts, of course, came into effect on April 1st, and the media was briefed on the changes we were making the week prior to that. These changes had been discussed in the business plans during the winter session, and the media announcement went forward as a formal notification to part of a formal notification to the residents of the Northwest Territories of the changes. Letters were also sent out to each of the lessees on March 19th, 2018. The press, the media had been aware of these changes. I see a story as long ago as February 2017 when these very changes were discussed. So really it was an update to that information. Thank you.
Oral question, member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for that answer. I understand, you know, he made a commitment and talked about us at Sketty in 2017, but why wasn't this information given to us saying this is going to it's going to happen April 1st? We didn't hear nothing about it, and I attended a number of the meetings, so I may have missed the meeting. So why weren't we informed of this happening? Because again, it's a Christmas gift, not one I wanted, but it's a Christmas gift from the minister. So will he please explain why it took him until after we had session? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Lands.
Mr. Speaker, a letter was sent to Standing Committee in August of 2016 indicating that we were thinking about changing these fees that had been in effect for a very long period of time. The changes were proposed in the 2016-17 business plans and discussed with committee and also discussed during the Lands Mains estimates in February 2017, in accordance with our established protocols. In July 2017, we informed SCOP that the consultation period had closed and that we were proceeding with amending regulations and that the pre-Gazette period was about to start. The period was for 90 days and ended on October 1st. This was the official period when interested stakeholders could make representations to the minister to change course. On March 17th, 2018, I sent an email to all members providing information on the fee increases. So these increases should not have come as a surprise to the public or the members opposite. Thank you.
Oral question, member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that long answer and well detailed, and I appreciate that. And I guess I might have missed that email. But again, I guess I love the way we sent a letter, and that's consulting people. How did we engage the people of the residents of the Northwest Territories that were impacted by this decision? Because N.W.T. lands has a huge impact on not only in the small communities that I represent, but their cabins. So how did you engage the people in Northwest Territories? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Lands.
Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned earlier, there was a consultation period that closed on October 1st, 2017. And of course, this matter was before the public. As I mentioned, it was in the media. It was discussed in the House, so people were certainly aware of these changes that were coming. So I think there was sufficient consultation with the public on this issue. We certainly did hear from members opposite, and I'm sure members opposite will recall that we did make amendments to certain of the proposed amendments, in the sense that we lowered from 10 to 5% of the assessed value of certain residential properties, which was a concern of the members opposite, particularly the member from Tunaday-Willowday. Thank you.
Merci. Or question, Nundere Kasi member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I must apologize to the House because maybe I'm not getting my question across properly. I'm not talking about commissioners' land. We understand that. I actually proposed a 3% reduction. He come back and, he was actually saying it was good at 10%, and then he come back to 5%. I'm still baffled by this. So will the minister look at this again and actually consult and engage people properly? Not letters, not using the public and not using us, but getting out there and talking to the people that are impacted by this decision. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I may have said that the 10% rate was good. The 5% was even better. We certainly did listen to the members opposite as they raised concerns. I think there was an extensive period of consultation. As I say, this issue was certainly before the public, in the sense that it had been reported in the House and raised many times quite properly by the members opposite. So I think the proper consultation was done, and that the changes we've made were and are reasonable. Thank you.
Or a question, can the member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today my questions are for the Minister of Finance. I spoke earlier today in my member statement sharing some concerns about the cost of living. And Mr. Speaker, some reports are actually suggesting that the N.W.T's best years are in fact behind us, and that's concerning. Real GDP will fall by 2.9% this year and is projected to fall by a rate of 1.1% for the next 20 years. The Minister of Finance certainly has to be aware of these figures. I'd like to ask the Minister, what does the Department of Finance make of these projections, and what kind of plan, if at all, if there is a plan, does the Minister and the Department have to reverse these trends, Mr. Speaker? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, our best years are behind us, not the N.W.T's. And I would have to disagree. I would have to disagree with any report that suggests that the best years are behind us. We are aware of these projections and other scenarios. That's why we were working hard to manage our fiscal resources. And as members of this Assembly may recall, right at the beginning of the 18th Assembly, we were challenged with a $34 million decrease in our territorial formula financing. And then just last year with our corporate taxes, there was a further decrease. So I think we've done well in trying to manage our fiscal resources to ensure that we meet some of these challenges that are coming before us. We're working on developing a number of opportunities like commercial fishing and agriculture and the manufacturing sectors to continue to support economic diversification in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Good.
Or a question, Kidder, member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm happy to hear that the Minister has a degree of optimism and a degree of confidence. That's good to hear. We want to hear that from the Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, the number of seniors in the N.W.T is set to triple by the year 2040. This aging population will lead to rapidly increased health care costs. I'd like to ask the Minister, if our economy is not on the upward trend and continues to show signs of being flat, and we can't seem to find ways to increase our own source revenues through royalties or otherwise, how will the Minister expect to cover these increased costs as a government? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, we were elected by the people in the Northwest Territories to make decisions, and sometimes hard decisions have to be made. We have to remain optimistic in all that we do, even with challenges before us, because if they see 19 members of the Legislative Assembly going around saying, "Oh, woe is me," and head for the border, then that doesn't send a very good message. Our opportunity here is to send a message that, as a member I think said before, one of the members said, let residents of Northwest Territories know that we have their backs. And I'm trying to send that message, and we'll do anything we can with the support of this Assembly to ensure that we're in a position to continue to invest. We know we're being challenged with an aging population, and a lot of our money comes from the territorial formula financing. And so we have to ensure we continue to work with the federal government to make sure our needs are met. And at the same time, I've said before, we want to diversify our economy because we don't want to become a welfare state. We want to be able to generate our own revenue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Or question, Tada Cassie member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister once again. And I appreciate that he's sending a positive message. He knows that on occasion I try to do that, but I don't put lipstick on the message. I happen to be a realist, and when people write me, members or constituents write me to tell me that they're leaving the territory because the cost of increase are going up, and we, the government, happen to be one of the major impactors of the cost of living in the territory, that's troubling. So I'm just trying to get a better understanding of where our future is. Mr. Speaker, the government set a goal of attracting a couple thousand people to the N.W.T. in the last Assembly. New reports are indicating that with the decline in the GDP, outmigration will cause the labour force to shrink. I would like to ask the Minister, is the original plan for population growth still valid and feasible, or do we require a new strategy? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Finance.
Mr. Speaker, some of the early numbers show that our population has actually increased a bit the last couple of years. Very small, but it has increased. Yes, there are going to be people that leave. If there's no economic opportunities for them, people will leave and go to where the jobs are, and as they should. Our challenge here is to promote the N.W.T. as a positive place to invest and spend your money, and the rest of it will take care of itself. I don't think we need a strategy to tell us what we already know. I think we just have to ensure that we continue to promote the Northwest Territories as a place to invest and live and prosper. Our ITI Minister, our Premier, have been out promoting the Northwest Territories for a number of years, and we'll continue to do that. And I think as far as the out-migration goes, if people are going to start making investments in the territories, if it's feasible, then they will come back to the Northwest Territories. So we continue to work on that, and we promote the Northwest Territories as a place to invest. We have world-class resources here, and we have people trying to mine those resources or take advantage of the resources, and we continue to promote that and have people move back to the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question, Nundere Cassie member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I want to remain confident that the Minister's words are actually something that we can take as being put to action and be hopeful about, because a number of members from this side have spent the last few weeks traveling to a number of communities up and down the Northwest Territories, and there's still a lot of concern about outmigration. I'm not just talking about the N.W.T., I'm also talking about small communities that lose people to bigger regions and bigger centres in the Northwest Territories. Mr. Speaker, the Minister has stated that we need to use the first 2 years of this Assembly to get our fiscal house in order, and I appreciate that, and that we could make investments in the latter 2 years of this Assembly. We only have 16 months left in this term. Is the Minister confident that this government is in a position to make meaningful investments in the remainder of the life of this Assembly? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, it was made clear in the budget we've experienced some unanticipated revenue decline. But to the member's point, though, I mean, I am confident. I have to be. If your finance minister is not confident in the fiscal future in the Northwest Territories, may as well fold up his iPad and go home. And so I remain confident. We are challenged. We are in a position as members said, I pointed out our decline in revenues over the last couple of years. Because of the decisions we made as a Legislative Assembly, I think we were able to manage our way through that. And going forward, it was just recently announced a $570 million investment in infrastructure in the Northwest Territories. That's just the federal government's investment. We put ourselves in a position where we were able to come up with our 25 cents on the dollar, an additional $142 million. So that gives us $712.5 million, just in infrastructure investment, not counting all the other programs that the federal government has invested in Northwest Territory. But again, government shouldn't be the industry. Government should be promoting industry to invest in the, not just industry, everyone, to invest in the Northwest Territories as a place to work and live, and the rest will take care of itself. I am confident, I have to be, and I think the decisions we've made, as tough as some of them were, I think we'll manage to work our way through the challenges that come before us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, the member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. My questions are for the Minister of Infrastructure, who also chairs the Cabinet Committee on Energy and Climate Change. In my member statement, I noted how Cabinet's approach to meeting our climate change obligations under the Pan-Canadian framework has little or no hope for success. Can the Minister provide any justification for how the expansion of the Tolson system will lead to the predicted 44% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions when there is no funding for the project and no buyers for that power? Must see, Mr. Speaker.
Speaker, the 227 kiloton reduction anticipated from the Tolson expansion is a premise of hydro generation and transmission lines to displace any diesel power generation in Northwest Territories. The Government of Northwest Territories identified this priority as part of our response to the federal government's Canadian framework on clean growth and climate change, along with other energy and transportation priorities. Some of the work that we plan to do includes defining the potential market, capital costs, transmission line routing, and finalizing a business case that would connect sufficient anchor customers to absorb the green hydropower from the Tolson project. The electricity generated by this project can be used to support future industrial growth and renewable energy to offset diesel power generation and emissions. We are looking to the federal government to support this pre-construction work going forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, member Frame Lake.
Merci, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Minister for that. I don't feel that much more confident that that's actually going to result in greenhouse gas reductions. But in my member statement, I also referred to the fact that the specific target of greenhouse gas reductions for the industrial sector of 17% was removed from the final version of the Climate Change Strategic Framework. No explanation, no rationale provided. And I've raised in this House the need for a multi-stakeholder climate change roundtable with ministerial leadership to secure industry buy-in. Can the Minister explain why there is no target for industrial greenhouse gas emissions and how we can possibly meet the Pan-Canadian framework reductions without such a target? Must see, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In terms of industrial targets, the specific emissions reduction target of 89 kilotons for an industry is identified in the graphic shown actually on page 32 of the Climate Change Strategic Framework. This target for industry is part of the overall 517 kiloton reduction target for the N.W.T to be achieved by 2030 through the strategic objectives and actions outlined in the 2030 energy strategy. The Department of Environment and Natural Resources is working on a climate change strategic framework action plan, which they expect to finalize later this year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'd like to thank the Minister for that and the information about how that figure is hidden in a graphic rather than set out clearly in the strategy itself. But I've raised the issue of poor communications around climate change planning and the surprise addition of the specific and large reductions to greenhouse gas emissions attributed to Tolson expansion. We don't even know what the carbon pricing system is going to be and how that fits into our climate change initiatives either. Can the minister tell the public and regular MLAs whether the energy strategy and climate change strategic framework or some compilation of these documents has been submitted to the federal government for consideration in meeting our pan-Canadian framework obligations on greenhouse gas reductions, and what the response has been from the federal government? Must see, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As all members are well aware, when we announced all three of these together, the 2030 Climate Change Strategic Framework, the 2030 Energy Strategy, and the Petroleum Strategy, as they're all linked together, was publicly released here in the Assembly on May 1st of 2018. Various federal officials have already been made aware of this. To date, the N.W.T has not received any formal feedback from any federal ministers at this point, but the response that we've had from federal people so far has been very positive, and they are pleased that we're doing our part to meet the Pan-Canadian Framework targets. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nundere Cassie, member of Frame Lake.
Must see, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the minister for that, and I'd look forward if he could share some of that information with this side of the House in the future in a regular updating. The Auditor General noted the failure of our government to provide adequate leadership through appropriate authority and procedures to ensure we meet climate change targets. I've noted the need for a Climate Change Act, Financial Management Board consideration of climate change implications in its decisions, and how infrastructure projects should be prioritized in terms of their greenhouse gas reductions. It's not clear when Cabinet is going to get serious about providing the appropriate authority procedures to implement our climate change efforts. I'd like to ask the Minister, what specific changes to authorities and procedures is Cabinet going to make to ensure climate change success, and when will this happen? Must see, Mr. Speaker.
Must see. Minister of Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, the government is working on the development of the 2019-23 action plan to guide the implementation of the 2030 Climate Change Strategic Framework, and this document will address those Auditor General's recommendations not already incorporated into the framework. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Must see. Oral question, the member Decho.
Must see, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I stated in my statement, I was very honored and proud to attend a special graduation on the Hay River Reserve, and these were celebrating a moment with students that, mature students that decided to go back to school and upgrade their education and at least meet requirements to graduate with high school. So it's common that throughout the N.W.T, our young people are facing challenges. So my question is to the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment. Why are high school graduation rates low in some small communities? And what is the Minister's plan of action to address them? Masi.
Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To actually pinpoint why graduation rates are low is difficult. It can be a lot of extenuating situations that make people leave school. It can be lack of support. It can be family dynamics. It can be poverty. It could be I met a new boyfriend and I just want to hit the road. So there's a whole host of reasons that... Sorry, my partner. So there's a whole host of reasons that students do leave school. But what we are noticing is that we do need to do something about it. It's not okay. So we are looking at things that we can control within the education and things that we can actually do to support students to make positive choices. So we do have currently we have a Pathways program that actually works with students. We're going to strengthen that. We need to actually look at getting more career counselors into the schools to actually working with them from younger grades, from grade 9, and talking about what do you want to do? Do you want to be a truck driver? Do you want to be a doctor? Do you want to work at Walmart? And not limiting their options, working with the students to define what their options, what their options are, what they would need once they choose an option, what school services and supports and curriculum that they would need to actually be successful in obtaining their their goals in life. But like I say, Mr. Speaker, we can do what we can from an education aspect, but a lot of the reasons children decide to drop out of school is not as simply as the education system itself. There's a lot of reasons. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nakita Cassie member Decho.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in small communities, we're challenged. Of course, most jobs and a lot of the benefits of industrial-type projects, or go to where the actions are, and usually larger centers. So, small communities struggles, but we're seeing some trends in terms of out-migration of small community, people moving to larger centers. At the same time, there was a recent study that pointed to an alarming trend that there's gaps between the education levels of larger centers like the city of Yellowknife and smaller communities where there's a gap where if a high school student from a small community graduated grade 12 compared to a student that graduated grade 12 in Yellowknife, and they both go down south, they're challenged and they have to upgrade. So what are some strategies that possibly the minister is considering to lead to his or her department to address those very challenges? Merci.
I'd like to remind members that with the questions and answers, the preambles should be shortened, and also the answering questions also should be shortened because we only have 15 minutes and we still have 4 individuals, MLAs, still in line to ask questions. So I'd just like to remind members. Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, the effective urbanization is affecting not only the Northwest Territories, it's small communities throughout Canada. Internationally, actually, it is happening that people are moving from smaller communities into the regional or larger centers, larger community centers, because there's more opportunities there. So we have to work on it. Pathways, like I talked about, making people look at their options earlier is one way. One new thing that we're actually doing as well, that, and I have to thank the MLA who brought it up in the community of YELLOWKNIFE, having 3 graduates that did the distance education program with support. It's not on their own. It's not like home studies. Shows that it's working. That was a pilot. We need to expand on that. We have the small communities fund that we're working with, and actually we're working closely with MLAs in our small community committee to look at how we can actually put more economy, more opportunities within the communities to support them. So we will do what we can to make sure that we provide as much support to not only children, but adults within small communities. But we also have a freedom of mobility within constitutional right that even though we will do whatever we can, people have the right to be mobile and to move. It might not be ideal, but so we will provide what we can to support, to sustain small communities, but we will not limit people from being able to migrate as they want. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Tadare Kasi, member Decho.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, community learning centers exist in small communities, and so my question is to the minister: what role can they continue playing in terms of trying to work with mature students that decide to go back to school to upgrade and qualify for high school equivalencies? Merci.
Of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our community learning centres are critical, especially to the smaller communities that the MLA has spoken about, because they actually are working on the ground with people. They're looking at people that perhaps have dropped out and need to have adult education programs. They can provide the access program, which will give people the prerequisites and support so that they can get into college or university if that's where they need to go. They can do specialized programs in different areas. So the problem is though that, Mr. Speaker, we need to make sure that community learning centres, that education from junior kindergarten to post-secondary are providing quality services. And so one of the things that I really want to work on is making sure that all of our education supports are accountable, have measurable outcomes, and that we are regularly evaluated. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question. No data Cassie member Decho.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the life of the 18th Assembly is coming down. Our term is coming up, and similarly, the minister has a new portfolio. So, besides addressing the rates of low graduation levels in small communities, and the N.W.T for that matter, what are the minister's priorities in the remaining term of the 18th Assembly? Masi.
Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. People that know me know I'm a hard worker. Staff that have worked with me in other departments know that I'm a hard minister. I don't plan on letting either of those go. My priority within this, the remainder of the time, is to actually make sure, as I stated just before, that all of our education supports are based on best practices, that they are accountable, that we have measurable outcomes, that we evaluate them regularly. So, and that is often called accreditation. So I'm not asking people to get to the point of accreditation, but I think we need to work towards that. So it's about quality programming is my focus for the remainder of the time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, County, the member Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I stated my priorities for housing in Yellowknife Centre with its long waiting lists for families and senior housing and also unaffordable private market rentals. I'd now like to hear from the minister responsible for the N.W.T Housing Corporation and homelessness what his priorities are. Thank you.
Minister of N.W.T Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned in answering some of the core housing needs with a previous member, we want to continue focusing and supporting those programs, supporting our LHOs, working with our stakeholders, our community governments, our Indigenous governments to addressing the core housing needs across, not only just here in Yellowknife, right across the Northwest Territories. We do have high waiting lists for people trying to get into housing. We do have a lot of housing units that need to be retrofitted, upgraded. Some of them are ending their year of life. And we also need to focus and work with our federal government in making sure that we work on rectifying some of the shortages that we had with the Northern Housing Strategy. So there's a few priorities in there. I'm willing to work with members, work with our Indigenous governments, our community governments to address the core housing need. We've got about 1.5 years left in this government, and we got to focus on making sure that our residents have safe and affordable housing units. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, Akira Cassie, member Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it said that if everything's a priority, nothing is a priority. And so what I'm hearing here is that the list is just unmanageable in terms of actually getting anything done. So I'm going to zero in on a couple of specific things. What is the minister's plan to reduce invisible homelessness among families by extending the territorial government's Housing First funding to them? Thank you.
N.W.T Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned earlier as well, we do have the Community Housing Support Initiative as well as the Rent Supplement Program. A lot of work that the Housing Corporation has done over this government to address those needs and working with the NGOs and giving them some of the rent supplements so they can help work with us to house and address some of these housing concerns that the member has mentioned. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question, Tadade Cassie, member Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to repeat my question. The question is about extending the Housing First program to homeless families in Yellowknife. Will the minister provide that funding? Thank you.
Minister of N.W.T Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We did see some really good results out of the Housing First program, and working with the City of Yellowknife as well as the Yellowknife Women's Society to address these housing needs. And we will continue to work with them. And we got to make sure that we also secure funding from our federal counterparts to address housing needs right across the Northwest Territories, and looking at that model and trying to get that model out into some of our regional centers where we also see very high housing waiting lists as well as homelessness in some of our regional centres, and taking that model that the member has mentioned and seeing how we can adjust it to the regional centres and even perhaps some of our small communities. But yes, we will continue to work with our stakeholders on how to adjust that funding and also with the federal government to increase our funding. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, N.W.T, Cassie, member YELLOWKNIFE Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have a family of 6 living in a bachelor apartment. They've been there for 3 years. What's the minister going to be able to do to help them now? Thank you.
Minister of N.W.T Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned, we do have the rent supplement program that we help with our families that are in need. We also have programs through EC&E in terms of income support. We do know that there's a lot of NGOs that do a lot of great work working with us to address some of the core housing needs across the Northwest Territories. And the member mentions that we do have a family of 6. In some of our small communities where we don't even have housing, those numbers go up, and that's what we need to work on addressing. Right across the Northwest Territories, we do have high waiting lists for housing, and we need to make sure that priority is given where it's needed. And I want to work with the members to work on adjusting those. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Canada, member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have a few questions for Minister of Infrastructure. Can the Minister give us a brief update on the work that was done to both the Abraham Francis and Lewis Cardinal ferries this year? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Speaker. We'll try to make this quick, try to get some more questions in for everybody. The Louis Cardinal this year, we were doing paint and deck repairs is underway all this week. We installed 4 brand new engines in the Louis Cardinal this season during the winter year. The department is working with Transport Canada to complete the vessel inspections on that and inspect the new engines and the hull to be conducted today with the federal government. On the Abraham Francis, there's ramps that are going to be replaced. One of them is being completed already, and we are hopefully going to have the other one completed this week. Paint and deck repairs is also being completed this week, and the Peel River is now clear of ice, and we are working on the landing as things commence today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question, Akira Cassie, member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, will the work that is being undertaken be completed on time and not hold up the operation of the ferry services? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've said, this work is commencing as we speak. If members recall, last year one of the holdups we had was Transport Canada officials that do the inspections got called away to off to some other needy thing that they had to look after before they came back to the members' riding to inspect the ferries, which held the things up. But as things are looking going forward here for this season, sounds like all the inspections will be done, and ferries should hopefully be in the water as early as Monday, and hopefully within 3 days of water testing, the ferries will be in operation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Cassie, member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that leads me to my next question, which he answered a part of, but when can my constituents expect to have services resumed for the summer? According to his math, that's May 31st. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, as soon as we have Transport Canada approval to begin operation, the ferries will start operating. We're hoping, as I said, that probably the Fort McPherson ferry will be the first one in operation, and hopefully by May 28th or June 1st at the very latest would be the Sigachik ferry. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Canada, member Satu.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. My 2 questions here is in the spirit of time. Is to the Minister ITI in regards to further in my member statement on Destination Delaney. Will the Minister commit to having the regional staff sponsor and facilitate a hospitality workshop in Delaney? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism, Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We could certainly look into that. I know Destination Delaunay and the member have been working very hard to attract tourism, and they signed an MOU with a number of companies in China on their last trade mission there. We will certainly work with the community. I know the department has spent a lot of money investment, up to over $500,000 on helping them get their self-position as Destination Delaunay, and we'll certainly talk to our department and our regional staff and see what we can do. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Cassie, member Satu.
Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the Minister for the response here. My next and final question is, as mentioned in my member statement here, there will be a group later coming to the community of Delaunay, a contingent of approximately 25 agents. Will the Minister have check his schedule to see if he can participate in that attendance on that gathering? Mussey?
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the member could share the date with my staff, we'll certainly have a look at it. Anything we can do to promote tourism in the Northwest Territory, especially around Aboriginal tourism and in the small communities to help bring economic opportunities to them, we will certainly participate. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good, Minister.
Mussey. Oral question. Ikeda Canyon, the member Hay River North.
Just snuck in there, Mr. Speaker. I didn't think I was going to get it. There was today. I've noticed there's been a lot of negative talk about the economy. There's been a lot of finger pointing and adversarial back and forths. Let's change the conversation. Let's talk about economic growth. Let's talk about investment. Let's talk about cabinet and regular members working together. Let's talk about the Hay River Fish Processing Plant, Mr. Speaker. When I last brought this up, it was February, and at that time, the Minister of ITI was still trying to secure some federal funding. So I'd like an update in general on the fish plant, where we are with that federal funding, when we're going to be breaking ground, and anything else you'd like to share with us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Speaker, as all members know, the department is fully committed to this process. We believe in revitalizing the fishing strategy. We want to implement this strategy. We have committed significant funds from this government towards this strategy, and we've also committed a position to help assist the freshwater or the fishermen in Hay River and moving this strategy forward. We are working with other federal departments to secure some funding around this and other funding partners. These initial discussions are still looking very promising, and at the right appropriate time I'll announce what kind of dollars we have to put towards this fish plant. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mussey. Oral question. Nakita Cassie, member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And when we last discussed this, the Minister mentioned it was a $12 million fish plant, maybe $9 million, depending on the funding. And there are some concerns arising with that price tag, namely the O&M associated with running a plant like that. There's some fishermen who are concerned that, the department is going to saddle them essentially with this massive fish plant, and they might not be able to afford it in the future if times get bad. And so I was wondering, what sort of financial risks are the fishermen, whether it's the Fishermen's Federation or the Tucho Cooperative, going to incur as a result of managing this plant in the government's plans? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A business plan was developed in partnership with the Tucho Fishery, which is the business arm of the N.W.T. Fishing Federation. And, excuse me, Mr. Speaker, the accounts for utilities were part of the operational expense. The business plan was based on a worst-case scenario, and it still shows a profit based on the historic catches of the lake and especially the latest quotas we've been pulling out of the lake. So worst-case scenario, this thing still makes money. We want to see this thing succeed. That's why we put so much energy and time and money into this. We're working with the fishermen to make sure that this becomes a profitable business for them. I personally have a vested interest in trying to, I've seen what the Freshwater Marketing Corp has done to the fishermen in Hay River, and I don't think there was a significant amount of investment from them over the last few years that's really made that place hard to manage and hard to operate. A brand new fish plant will bring different opportunities to them. We want to find different ways to do secondary processing to actually, beyond the business case, to help support them to make more money and contribute to higher returns to fishers in the N.W.T. And we will continue to work on that and reduce and mitigate any risk to them. But like with any business opportunity, there is risk. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question. Tada Cassie, member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Another issue or another concern that some of the fishermen have is that because of the issues with fresh water that the minister has mentioned and because of the price of fish, some fishermen have developed local markets. You know, and they have quite robust local markets. They have regular customers, and they can make a good living this way. And so the concern is that the N.W.T's plan to revitalize the fishery might encroach on some of these local markets. So can the minister guarantee that the plan to revitalize the fishery doesn't include local sales that are going to directly compete with the fishermen currently selling fish? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Tourism investment.
As part of the Great Slave Commercial Revitalization Policy Planning and a two-price system, the wholesale to fisher and retail price was proposed to N.W.T. freshwater marketing people, or Federation, sorry, to consider and was approved several years ago. Like anything, the intent of the strategy is not to compete and displace existing sales channels that fishers have and compete against small businesses, but to assist them having adequate supply of year-round fulfillment for sales opportunities and develop new ones. And as the member knows from Hay River, some of the challenges around the way the fishery is right now, we don't even have year-round supply. I wanted to get some fish earlier this spring, and it makes a challenge just because of the lack of supply. And we believe that this is not going to hurt the local fishing people that are there. It's going to help entice more sales locally and be better returns for the local fishermen. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, no data, Cassie, member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And part of the reason that the government is pushing this fish plan is because nobody quite knows what's happening with Freshwater Fish Marketing Corporation in the near future. Since the minister has a direct channel to Ottawa, could the minister please let us know what the N.W.T. knows about the future plans for freshwater? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
The department has been in contact with DFO, and at present they still have not indicated what the future plans are regarding the Freshwater Fish Marketing Corporation. But they have expressed to myself and the Premier for sure that they want to ensure that the inland fishery survives and sustainably moving forward, and we will continue to update this House as we get more information what DFO's plans are. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mussey. Time for oral question has expired. Written questions. Written questions. Returns to written question. Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Speaker, I have a return to written question 9-18-3 asked by the member for Nahende on March 15, 2018 to the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment regarding society's eligibility for the business incentive policy. Mr. Speaker, I have a return to written question 8-18-3 asked by the member for Cam Lake on March 14, 2018 to the Minister of Health and Social Services regarding health information systems. Mr. Speaker, I have a return to written question 7-18-3 asked by the member for Yellowknife Centre on February 23, 2018 regarding the Housing Core Need Action Plan. Mr. Speaker, I have a return to written question 3-18-3 asked by the member for Frame Lake to the Premier on February 7, 2018 regarding Government of the Northwest Territories participation in the Association for Mineral Exploration Roundup in January 2018. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I have a return to written question 10-18-3 asked by the member for Yellowknife North on March 15, 2018 to the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment regarding the Senior Home Heating Fuel Subsidy Program. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mussey. Returns to written questions. Returns to written questions. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Petitions. Petitions. Reports of Standing Special Committee. Reports of Standing Special Committee. Reports on Committee on the Review of Bills. Reports on Committee on Review of Bills. Tabling of documents. Minister of Lands.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following two documents entitled Follow-up Letter for Oral Question 121-18 in brackets 3, Terra X, Ptarmigan Mine, and Follow-up Letter for Oral Question 165-18 in brackets 3, Land Tenure Engagement Sessions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mussey. Tabling of documents. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to table the following 11 documents entitled Follow-up Letter to Oral Question 152-18 bracket 3, home care services. Follow-up letter to oral question 170-18-3, privacy breaches in healthcare facilities. Follow-up letter to oral question 179-18-3, medical travel. Follow-up letter to oral question 187-18-3, alcohol consumption during pregnancy. Follow-up letter to oral question 196-18-3, youth apprehension policies. Follow-up letter to oral question 199-18-3, medical travel. Follow-up letter to oral question 225-18-3, Health Information Act. Follow-up letter to oral question 242-18-3, dialysis services. Follow-up letter to oral question 259-18-3, mental health challenges in Nahende. Follow-up letter to oral question 273-18-3, travel for elders with health issues during freeze-up and breakup. And further to my written question 8-18-3, I wish to table Health Information Act designated electronic health information systems. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Documents. Minister of Infrastructure.
Following two documents entitled Follow-up Letter to Oral Question 253-18-3, Ice Road Operations, and Follow-up Letter for Oral Question 263-18-3, Dredging of the Port of Hay River. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mussey. Tabling documents. Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Mr. Speaker, further to my return to written questions 10-18-3, I wish to table the following document entitled Zones and Eligibility of the Senior Home Heating Subsidy Program as of April 1st, 2018. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mussey. Tabling documents. Minister of Municipal Community Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to table the following 7 documents entitled Follow-up Letter for Oral Questions 80-18-3 and Oral Questions 278-18-3, Status of Amendments to the Cities, Towns and Villages Act. Follow-up Letter for Oral Questions 131-18-3, Amendments to the Cities, Towns and Villages Act for a Hotel Tax Levy. Follow-up Letter for Oral Questions 161-18-3, Emergency Planning Resources. Follow-up letter for oral questions 172-18-3 and oral questions 178-18-3, R2 Winter Games Athlete Selection and Travel. Follow-up letter for oral questions 195-18-3, Ground Ambulance and Highway Rescue Services. Follow-up letter for oral questions 205-18-3, Promoting Traditional Hand Games. And follow-up letter for oral questions 234-18-3 and 238-18-3, Norman Wells Fire Department. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Tabling of documents. Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table a response to petition 1-18-3 provided by the Minister of Municipal and Community Affairs in response to a petition tabled by the member for Yellowknife North on February 21st, 2018. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mussey. Tabling of documents. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I wish to table the following document. It's a letter from the Giant Mine Oversight Board dated April 26, 2018 to the Prime Minister of Canada regarding calls for an apology and compensation related to the operations of Giant Mine and its effects on the Indigenous peoples of the region. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I give notice that on Monday, May 28, 2018, I will move that Bill 13, an act to amend the Securities Act, be read for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Minister of Justice.
I give notice that on Monday, May 28, 2018, I will move that Bill 14, Miscellaneous Statute Law Amendment Act 2018, be read for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Minister of Justice.
Speaker, I give notice that on Monday, May 28, 2018, I will move that Bill 15, Document Formalization Service and Notice Reform Statute Law Amendment Act, be read for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mussey. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I give notice that on Monday, May 28, 2018, I will move that Bill 16, an act to amend the Social Assistant Act, be read for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Mr. Speaker, I give notice that on Monday, May 28, 2018, I'll move that Bill 17, an act to amend the Student Financial Assistance Act, be read for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Minister of Municipal Community Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I give notice that on Monday, May 28, 2018, I will move that Bill 18, an act to amend the Cities, Towns and Villages Act, be read for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Motions. Motions. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration Committee of the Whole of bills and other matters. Minister Statement 1-18.3. Minister Statement 19-18.3 with Member Hay River North in the chair.
I'll now call Committee of the Whole to order. What is the wish of committee? Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that the chair rise and report progress. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. There's a motion to report progress. The motion is in order, non-debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. I will now rise and report progress.
May I have the report, Member Hay River North?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Your committee has been considering Member Statement 1-18 brackets 3 and Minister's Statement 19-18 brackets 3 and would like to report progress. And Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the Committee of the Whole be concurred with.
Do I have a seconder? Member for Yellowknife North. Motion's in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Mussey. Mussey, members? Members, I'd like to draw your attention to the President's visitors in the gallery. We have with us a former member, former speaker as well, Mary Jane Joel. Mussey for being here with us. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Mr. Clerk, orders of the day.
Mr. Speaker, there will be a meeting of the Legislative Assembly Board of Management at the Rise of the House today in Committee Room A, as well as a meeting of the Standing Committee on Government Operations at 5 p.m. in Committee Room B. Orders of the day for Friday, May 25th, 2018, 10 a.m. Prayer, minister statements, member statements, returns to oral questions, recognition of visitors in the gallery, acknowledgements, oral questions, returns to written questions, replies to Commissioner's opening address, petitions, reports of standing and special committees, reports of committees on the review of bills, tabling of documents, notices of motions for first reading of bills, motions, first reading of bills, second reading of bills, consideration in committee of the whole of bills and other matters, Minister Statement 1-18.3 and Minister Statement 19-18.3, report of committee of the whole, third reading of bills, orders of the day.
Clerk, this House stands adjourned until Friday, May 25th, 2018, 10 a.m.
Order.